Somewhere in your life right now, there is a problem you've been carrying around so long, it started to feel like part of your identity. You know the one. It replays in the shower. It shows up right before you fall asleep. It sits quietly in the back of every conversation, waiting for a gap to slip back into your thoughts. And here's the question I want you to sit with, right at the start of this journey. How much of your life, up to this moment, have you spent thinking about the problem versus thinking about the way through it? Most people never ask themselves that question. Not because they're careless, because the mind, left untrained, is drawn to problems the way water is drawn downhill. It's not weakness, it's wiring. But here's what almost nobody tells you: that wiring can change. The same mind that's been circling your problems on autopilot for years can be trained, gently, patiently, to circle solutions instead. Not through denial, not through forced positivity, through something quieter and far more powerful, a shift in where your attention actually goes. This is not a story about ignoring what's wrong. It's a story about what happens when you finally stop giving your problems more attention than they've earned, and start giving your own capability the attention it deserves. And somewhere in the chapters ahead, something in you is going to recognize exactly where this has been happening in your own life, quietly, invisibly, for years. Before we go further, if this is the kind of thing that speaks to you, do one small thing. Hit subscribe. Not for me, for the version of you who's going to need this exact reminder again, on a day when the problems feel louder than the solutions. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The mind is always looking for something. Right now, in this exact moment, your mind is scanning. It never fully stops. Even in the quietest moment of your day, some part of your brain is running a background search, looking for what's wrong, what's missing, what needs fixing, what might go wrong next. This isn't a personal flaw. It's not something broken in you specifically. It's the oldest operating system your brain has, inherited from ancestors who survived not by noticing what was going well, but by noticing, instantly, what could kill them. Think about it from that angle for a moment. A distant ancestor standing in tall grass didn't survive by admiring the sunset. They survived by catching, out of the corner of their eye, the faint rustle that might be a predator. The ones who scanned constantly for danger lived long enough to have children. The ones who relaxed into appreciating the scenery, more often than not, didn't. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that scanning for danger mind won, generation after generation, and it became the default setting every human being is born with. This is why, if you're honest with yourself, it's so much easier to replay the one critical comment from a performance review than to remember the 5 pieces of praise that came with it. It's why one argument with someone you love can dominate your emotional weather for days, while 100 peaceful, connected moments with that same person barely register. Your mind isn't malfunctioning when it does this. It's doing exactly the ancient job it was built for. The problem is simply that the job description hasn't been updated in a very long time, while the world it's operating in has changed completely. Here's what almost no one tells you though, and it's the single idea this entire journey is built on. What your mind scans for is not fixed. It's trainable. The brain has a remarkable, well-documented property. It strengthens whatever pathway gets used most often, and lets the pathways it doesn't use quietly fade. This means the more you rehearse looking at what's wrong, the sharper and faster your problem finding becomes. And it means, just as truly, that the more you deliberately practice looking for what's workable, what's within reach, what's already going right, what the next possible step might be, the sharper and faster that becomes too. Your attention is not a passive mirror reflecting the world exactly as it is. It's a muscle. And like any muscle, it grows in whichever direction you actually train it. Let me tell you about a man named Callum. Callum ran a small business that, for 2 straight years, seemed to lurch from crisis to crisis. A supplier falling through, a key employee leaving, a slow season that lasted longer than anyone expected. By the end of those 2 years, Callum described himself, only half joking, as someone who'd started to see catastrophe in everything. A slightly delayed shipment felt like the beginning of the end. A single unhappy customer review felt like proof the whole business was failing. He wasn't imagining these events. They were real, and they mattered. But something about the way his mind had learned to process them had changed. Every new piece of information, good or bad, got filtered instantly through a lens that was scanning, constantly, for the next disaster. What Callum eventually realized, with the help of a mentor who'd built and lost and rebuilt several businesses of his own, was that he'd trained himself, unintentionally, through 2 years of genuine crisis, into a kind of chronic threat scanning. And the mentor said something to him that Callum repeated to me almost word for word, because it had landed so hard. Your problems aren't the reason you're stuck. Your problems are just the current data. It's what you've trained your mind to do with that data that's actually running your life. That distinction is worth sitting with, because it changes everything about how you relate to difficulty. A problem is simply information, a gap between where things are and where you want them to be. That's all it is, structurally. But an untrained mind takes that neutral piece of information and immediately spirals it outward, into worst-case scenarios, into self-blame, into a fog so thick it becomes hard to see that a gap, by definition, has two sides, where you are and where you're trying to get to. A trained mind receives the exact same information and does something different with it. It registers the gap, feels whatever is honest to feel about it, and then, critically, turns its attention toward the second half of that structure. What would closing this gap actually require? This is not about pretending problems don't matter. Callum's shipment delays were real. His difficult season was real. Nothing about training his mind toward solutions made the actual circumstances disappear. What changed was how much of his limited daily attention got spent marinating in the problem versus building the bridge across it. And that shift, it turns out, made a measurable difference. Not in whether hard things happened, because hard things kept happening, the way they do in any real business or any real life, but in how quickly Callum moved through them, and how much unnecessary suffering he carried along the way. Here's something worth understanding about attention itself, because it's the foundation for everything else in this journey. Attention is not just a spotlight illuminating what's already there. Attention actively shapes what you're capable of seeing next. When your mind is locked in problem scanning mode, solutions can be sitting in plain view, and your brain will, quite literally, filter them out as irrelevant, because it's been trained to prioritize threat-related information over opportunity-related information. This is why people in the grip of a crisis so often say, afterward, "I don't know why I didn't think of that obvious solution sooner." It wasn't hidden. Their attention simply wasn't built in that moment to register it. This is also, I think, one of the most hopeful facts in all of psychology. If attention can be trained toward threat by repetition, it can be retrained toward possibility by repetition too. You are not stuck with the scanning pattern you happen to have right now, no matter how long you've had it, no matter how many hard years reinforced it. The mind that spent a decade searching for what's wrong can, with deliberate practice, become a mind that searches, just as automatically, for what's next. Not because the world becomes easier, because you become someone whose default lens looks for the door instead of just cataloging the walls. I want to leave you, at the end of this first chapter, with a small but important question to carry forward. When something goes wrong in your life, today, this week, notice, just notice, how long you spend in the problem before your mind turns, even briefly, toward the solution. Don't judge whatever you find, just notice it. Because that noticing, simple as it sounds, is the very first step in retraining a lifetime of scanning toward something better. In the next chapter, we're going to look more closely at exactly why the problem-focused mind feels so hard to escape once it takes hold, and the surprising, often uncomfortable reason your brain sometimes resists the very solutions it claims to want. Chapter 2: Why your mind resists the very solutions it wants. Here's a strange contradiction worth sitting with for a moment. Almost everyone says they want their problems solved, and yet, if you watch closely, really closely, you'll notice something curious. A part of the mind often resists the solution, even while insisting, loudly, that it wants one. This sounds almost impossible to believe until you've caught yourself doing it. Someone offers a genuinely useful piece of advice for a problem you've been complaining about for months, and instead of relief, you feel a flicker of irritation. Someone suggests a workable next step, and you find yourself listing reasons it wouldn't work before you've even considered it seriously. If you've ever felt that flicker, I want you to know, you're not being difficult, and you're not broken. You're experiencing one of the least understood dynamics of the human mind, the strange comfort of a familiar problem over the uncertainty of an unfamiliar solution. Let's understand why this happens, because understanding it is the first step to no longer being ruled by it. A problem you've lived with for a long time, however painful, has a peculiar kind of safety to it. You know its shape, you know how it behaves. You've built an entire identity, a set of routines, sometimes even a social role, around managing it. A solution, by contrast, is unknown territory. It requires you to become someone slightly different than the person who's been living inside the problem, and some part of the mind, the same ancient part obsessed with survival, treats unknown as more dangerous than familiar, even when the familiar thing is actively causing you pain. This is why people sometimes stay in situations that are clearly not working. A job, a relationship, a pattern of behavior, long after they can articulate, clearly and honestly, everything that's wrong with it. It's not that they can't see the problem, it's that some part of them finds the specific, known shape of that problem less frightening than the unspecific, unknown shape of what comes after solving it. Let me tell you about a woman named Ines. Ines had spent nearly 3 years complaining, to anyone who would listen, about a job that drained her, long hours, a manager who took credit for her work, a role that had stopped teaching her anything years earlier. Every conversation about it followed roughly the same pattern, a detailed, articulate account of everything wrong, followed by a vague, unconvincing, but it's complicated, whenever anyone suggested she start looking elsewhere. It took a blunt friend, over dinner one night, to ask her a question that cut straight through the fog. What are you actually afraid would happen if you left? And Inez, to her own surprise, found real fear underneath the question, not about the job search itself, but about who she'd be without the familiar, if exhausting identity of the overworked, underappreciated employee she'd been performing for 3 years. That identity, painful as it was, had structure. It had a story she could tell at parties. It had sympathy built in. Leaving meant stepping into a version of herself with no script yet written, and some old, protective part of her mind found that blankness more threatening than 3 more years of a job she hated. This is the quiet trap so many people fall into without ever naming it, mistaking the comfort of a known problem for the comfort of an actual solution. And once you can see this pattern clearly, once you can recognize that resistance to a good solution is not proof the solution is wrong, but often proof that some old part of you is simply afraid of the unfamiliar, something shifts. You stop taking that internal resistance as final, trustworthy information and start recognizing it, instead, as a predictable, almost automatic response to change itself. There's a second, closely related reason the mind resists solutions, and it's worth naming honestly. Sometimes, staying focused on a problem serves a hidden, unspoken purpose. It can be a way of avoiding responsibility, because as long as the problem is the center of attention, no one, including you, has to ask the harder question of what you're going to actually do about it. It can be a way of gathering sympathy or connection, because shared complaint is, for many people, one of the most reliable and familiar forms of bonding they know. It can even be a way of avoiding a bigger fear underneath, because focusing intensely on a solvable external problem is sometimes easier than facing an unsolvable internal question sitting quietly beneath it. None of this is a character flaw. It's simply how minds work when they haven't been trained to notice their own patterns. But naming it changes everything, because once you can see that a part of you might be quietly, unconsciously invested in keeping a problem alive, you gain the ability to ask a far more useful question than "How do I solve this?" You gain the ability to ask, "What exactly am I getting from holding on to this the way I currently am, and am I willing to let that go?" For Ines, the honest answer, once she finally sat with it, was uncomfortable but clarifying. The job had become, in a strange way, proof of her own effort and suffering, evidence she could point to, both for herself and others, of how hard she was working, how much she was enduring. Solving the problem meant giving up that particular, familiar form of self-worth and building a new one from scratch, based not on how much she endured, but on what she actually wanted to build. That's a much bigger shift than simply updating a resume. And once she could see that clearly, the resistance she'd been fighting for 3 years finally made sense and, more importantly, finally became something she could choose to move through instead of something invisible, running her decisions from underneath. Here's what I want you to carry forward from this chapter, because it will save you a great deal of confused frustration in the chapters ahead if you notice resistance rising in you when a real solution appears, a flicker of irritation, a rush of reasons it wouldn't work, a strange reluctance to even try. Do not take that resistance as proof the solution is wrong. Take it, instead, as a signal worth investigating. Ask yourself, gently and honestly, is this resistance protecting me from something real, or is it simply the old, ancient part of my mind, mistaking the unfamiliar for the unsafe? This single distinction between resistance that's protecting you from genuine danger and resistance that's simply flinching at change is one of the most valuable tools you will carry through the rest of this journey, because a solution-focused mind isn't a mind that never feels resistance. It's a mind that's learned to question that resistance honestly, instead of obeying it automatically. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a particular kind of thinking trap that keeps so many people circling their problems endlessly without ever moving toward a solution, and the surprisingly simple shift in language that can interrupt it almost immediately. Chapter 3. The question that keeps you stuck. There is a question so common, so seemingly reasonable, that almost no one thinks to examine it. And yet, this single question, asked repeatedly, can keep a person circling the exact same problem for years without ever moving an inch closer to a solution. The question is simply, why is this happening to me? I want to be careful here, because I'm not suggesting this question is never worth asking. There are moments, in grief, in genuine trauma, in situations that deserve real reflection, where understanding the why behind something matters enormously, and rushing past it in the name of solution focus would be its own kind of harm. But for the everyday problems that make up most of a life, the recurring conflict at work, the pattern that keeps showing up in your relationships, the goal that keeps slipping out of reach, why is this happening to me, often becomes less a genuine inquiry and more a closed loop, a question with no real exit, because it's aimed backward, at causes that in many cases can no longer be changed, rather than forward, at what might actually move things ahead. Notice the shape of that question closely. It centers you as something things happen to. It searches for causes, which is a search that can, technically, continue forever. There is always another layer, another contributing factor, another piece of context you could dig into, and it rarely, on its own, produces a next step. You can spend an entire year understanding, in exhaustive psychological detail, exactly why a problem exists, and still wake up the next morning with the problem fully intact, because understanding a cause and generating a path forward are, it turns out, two different mental operations entirely, and most people, without realizing it, have only ever practiced the first one. Let me tell you about a man named Yusuf. Yusuf had struggled for years with a recurring pattern in his career. He would perform brilliantly for the first year in any role, earn real praise and momentum, and then, without fail, plateau. Not fail exactly. Just quietly stop growing, stop pushing, stop reaching for the next level, until eventually he'd leave, restless, for a new role, where the same cycle would begin again. Yusuf had spent, by his own account, hundreds of hours, across several years of therapy, exploring why this kept happening. And he had, genuinely, gathered real insight, a fear of visibility rooted in an early experience of being punished for standing out, a comfort with being the promising newcomer rather than the established expert who could now be judged by a higher standard. All of this was true, and useful, and worth understanding. And yet, 4 jobs later, the pattern was still, stubbornly, repeating itself. What finally interrupted the cycle wasn't more digging into why, it was a single shift in the question itself, offered by a coach Yusuf started working with at the beginning of his 5th role. Instead of why do I keep plateauing, the coach asked him to sit every week with a completely different question. What is one specific thing this week that would move me past where I currently am? The difference between these two questions is subtle on the surface and enormous underneath. Why sends the mind backward into analysis, into causes, into a search that can continue indefinitely without ever requiring action. What would move me forward sends the mind in an entirely different direction, toward the present moment, toward concrete possibility, toward something that can actually be attempted this week, rather than merely understood. Yusuf described the shift as almost disorienting at first, because he'd spent so many years assuming that understanding a pattern deeply enough would eventually, automatically, dissolve it. What he discovered instead was that understanding, on its own, was necessary but not sufficient. It had to be paired with a different kind of question, one built not to explain the past, but to architect the next move. This is worth naming clearly, because it's easy to misunderstand. Shifting towards solution-focused questions is not the same as ignoring or suppressing genuine understanding. It's not about refusing to look at why something happened. It's about recognizing that why and what now are two separate tools, each useful for a different job, and that a mind trained only in the first tool will spend a lifetime understanding its problems in exquisite detail while making very little forward progress on any of them. There's a particular trap worth naming here too, because so many thoughtful, self-aware people fall into it without realizing the trap of mistaking insight for progress. It feels productive to understand a pattern deeply. It feels, in the moment, like real work is happening. And in a limited sense, it is. Insight matters, understanding matters, self-awareness genuinely matters. But insight alone, without a corresponding shift toward what now, can become its own quiet form of avoidance. A sophisticated, articulate way of staying exactly where you are, while feeling, all the while, like you're actively working on the problem. I want to offer you a practical distinction to carry forward from this chapter, one you can apply the very next time you catch yourself circling a problem without moving through it. When you notice yourself deep in why does this keep happening? Why am I like this? Why did this happen to me? Let yourself finish that thought, honestly, without rushing past anything that genuinely needs to be felt or understood. But then, deliberately, ask the second question, the one most people never think to add. And given everything I now understand, what is one specific, concrete thing I could actually do next? Notice the word specific in that question, because it matters enormously. A vague answer, I should try to be more confident, I should communicate better, doesn't actually move the mind out of the problem loop, because it's still abstract enough to avoid real commitment. A specific answer, I will say this exact sentence in tomorrow's meeting, I will send this one message today, gives your mind something concrete enough to actually act on, which is precisely what breaks the pattern of endless circling. For Yusuf, the specific answers, week after week, were almost embarrassingly small at first. Speaking up once in a meeting where he'd normally stay quiet, asking, directly, for a piece of feedback he was afraid to hear, applying for one stretch project he would previously have talked himself out of. None of these, individually, looked like the kind of breakthrough that explains a years-long pattern. But together, accumulated week after week, they did something the years of why-focused understanding alone had never managed. They built, slowly and concretely, a different track record, one where Yusuf could see, with his own eyes, evidence that he was capable of pushing past the exact point where he used to quietly stop. Here's the lesson worth carrying forward then, as we move deeper into this journey. Understanding a problem and solving a problem are not the same skill, and a mind trained only in the first will mistake its own sophistication for progress. The question, why is this happening, has its place, and deserves real respect when the moment calls for it, but paired always with its essential partner, what now, it becomes something far more powerful than understanding alone. It becomes movement. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something that quietly determines whether that movement actually happens or stalls out before it starts. The difference between a mind that focuses on what it lacks and one trained to notice, first, what it already has to work with. Chapter 4. What you already have to work with. There is a quiet, almost invisible habit that keeps more people stuck than almost any other single pattern, and it hides inside a sentence so common you've probably said it yourself this week without noticing. I can't do anything about this until I have. On the surface, this sounds like simple realism, and sometimes it genuinely is. There are real constraints in a real life, and pretending otherwise helps no one. But underneath this sentence, far more often than people realize, is a subtle mental habit worth examining closely, the habit of measuring a situation entirely by what's missing from it, while barely registering what's already present and available to work with. This habit has a name in psychology, though you don't need the technical term to recognize it once it's pointed out: scarcity focus. A mind trained towards scarcity looks at any given moment and instinctively catalogs the gaps first. What's lacking? What hasn't arrived yet? What would need to change before real progress could begin? It's not a conscious choice. It happens automatically, the same way the problem-scanning mind from Chapter 1 happens automatically, because a mind under any kind of real or perceived pressure tends to narrow its attention toward what's threatening or insufficient, and away from what's abundant or usable. The trouble with this habit is that it creates a strange, self-perpetuating trap. The more you focus on what you lack, the more real that lack starts to feel, and the harder it becomes to notice the resources that were, all along, sitting quietly within reach, waiting to be used. Let me tell you about a woman named Bijou. Bijou had a dream of starting a small design studio, something she'd wanted for years, and for years she'd told herself, genuinely believing it, that she couldn't start until she had enough savings to feel truly secure, a stronger portfolio, more industry connections, more certainty that it would actually work. Each of these felt, individually, completely reasonable. Together, they formed an ever-receding horizon that kept the studio permanently in the future, always one more requirement away from actually beginning. What finally shifted things for Bijou wasn't a sudden windfall of savings or a stroke of confidence. It was a conversation with a mentor who asked her a question that initially felt almost insulting in its simplicity. Forget what you don't have for a second. What do you actually have, right now, today, that you could use? Bijou almost dismissed the question. It felt too basic to be useful. But she sat with it anyway, and the list, once she actually let herself make it, surprised her. She had, it turned out, a laptop capable of running every piece of design software she'd need. She had 3 former colleagues who had, more than once, told her they'd hire her the moment she went independent. She had 11 years of design experience, a body of work she'd built without even thinking of it as a portfolio, and a spare 4 hours most weekends that she'd been spending, largely, on television she didn't particularly enjoy. None of this was new information. It had all been true for months, possibly years. What was new was that Bijou had never actually stopped to look at it as a starting point, because her attention had been so consistently trained on the gap between where she was and where she imagined she needed to be before starting was allowed. This is the quiet power hiding inside what's sometimes called an inventory of resources, and it's worth understanding not as a one-time exercise but as a mental habit you can build permanently. The deliberate practice of pausing before cataloging what's missing, to first catalog what's already present. Time, however limited, skills, however underused, relationships, however dormant, past experience, however unglamorous it feels in the moment. A solution-focused mind doesn't ignore real constraints. Bijou genuinely didn't have unlimited savings, and pretending otherwise would have been foolish. But it refuses to let the presence of a constraint completely obscure the presence of resources sitting alongside it. There's a particular reframe worth carrying forward here, because it changes the entire emotional texture of how a problem feels to hold. A mind fixated on scarcity experiences a challenge as a wall, solid, complete, blocking every direction at once. A mind trained to inventory its resources experiences the exact same challenge very differently, not as a wall, but as a set of specific, nameable gaps, sitting alongside a set of specific, nameable tools already available to begin closing them. The situation hasn't changed. the felt experience of the situation has changed enormously, from paralysis to a starting point. I want to be honest about something important here, because false optimism has no place in this journey. This is not a claim that resources alone always guarantee success, or that every constraint can be resourced away through positive thinking. Bijou's studio still took real effort, real risk, real months of uncertainty before it became sustainable. Some challenges genuinely do require resources you don't yet have, and part of solution-focused thinking is honestly identifying which resources are truly missing and building a real plan to acquire them, not pretending willpower alone closes every gap. But even in situations that genuinely do require something you don't yet have, an inventory of existing resources changes the starting point of the plan enormously. Instead of, "I need everything to be different before I can begin," it becomes, "Here's what I have to start with, and here, specifically, is the next resource I need to go acquire." The second version is not just more accurate, it's actionable in a way the first version, by its very structure, can never quite manage to be. Here's a practice worth carrying forward from this chapter, one you can apply to whatever challenge is sitting in your life right now. Before you list what's missing, and you will need to, honestly, at some point, take 5 minutes first to list what's already present. Not what you wish you had, what you actually, concretely have access to right now. Your specific skills, however modest they feel. The people in your life who might help, even in small ways. The hours, however few, that already exist somewhere in your week. The past experience, however unrelated it seems on the surface, that might actually apply. Write it down if you can. Say it out loud if you can't. Let yourself really see it, the way Bijou finally let herself see it, instead of glancing past it on the way to cataloging everything still missing. Because here is what I want you to understand, moving forward into the rest of this journey. A solution rarely announces itself as some external event arriving from outside your life to rescue you. Far more often, it's built, piece by piece, from resources that were already present, simply overlooked by a mind that had been trained, understandably but unnecessarily, to notice the gap before it noticed anything else. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a particular kind of internal voice, one that sounds at first like caution, but that often does far more to keep you stuck than it does to keep you safe. Chapter 5. The voice that calls itself realistic. There is a voice most people carry, and almost everyone mistakes it for wisdom. It speaks in a calm, measured tone. It doesn't shout the way panic does. It doesn't rage the way anger does. It simply, quietly, offers reasons, reasonable-sounding, carefully worded reasons, for why the harder path probably won't work, why the ambitious plan is probably unrealistic, why it might be safer, all things considered, to expect less. This voice calls itself realistic, and because it sounds so calm, so measured, so free of obvious emotional distortion, it's the voice people trust the most, often far more than they trust hope, which sounds, by comparison, naive and unreliable. But I want to invite you, in this chapter, to look at this voice more closely than you probably ever have. Because underneath its calm delivery, this voice is not always telling you the truth about the world. Often, it's telling you something else entirely, the truth about an old fear, dressed up in the language of clear-eyed reason. Let's understand where this voice tends to come from, because understanding its origin changes how much authority you give it. For many people, the inner voice of caution was built during a specific period, often childhood, often adolescence, when disappointment hurt in a particularly sharp way, and a young, developing mind made a quiet, protective decision: if I expect less, I'll be hurt less. This isn't irrational. It's a completely logical response to real pain. A child who was let down repeatedly by unreliable promises, or who watched a parent's big dreams collapse into visible disappointment, often learns early that hope itself carries risk, that wanting something openly and not getting it hurts worse than never quite letting yourself want it in the first place. The trouble is that this protective strategy, built to manage a child's specific pain in a specific moment, rarely gets updated. It simply continues operating, decades later, in an adult life with entirely different resources, entirely different capabilities, and entirely different stakes, still calling itself realistic, still offering its calm, reasonable-sounding reasons to expect less, long after the original danger it was protecting against has passed. Let me tell you about a man named Desmond. Desmond had, for as long as he could remember, described himself as a realist. When friends floated ambitious ideas, a business, a big move, a bold ask for a raise, Desmond was reliably the voice in the group offering the sober counterpoint. He wasn't wrong exactly, in any individual instance. His objections were usually specific, logical, hard to dismiss outright. But over the years, a pattern became visible to the people close to him. Even if Desmond himself hadn't fully named it, his realism, applied consistently enough, across enough different situations, in his own life and not just others, had quietly kept him from attempting almost anything that carried real risk of disappointment. It took a particular moment, watching a close friend take a leap Desmond himself had talked himself out of years earlier, and watching that leap actually succeed, for something in Desmond to crack open. Sitting with the discomfort of that moment, he asked himself, honestly, for maybe the first time, is my caution actually protecting me from real risk? Or is it protecting me from the specific feeling of wanting something and not getting it? The answer, once he let himself look at it clearly, was uncomfortable. Desmond's father had pursued a series of ambitious business ventures throughout Desmond's childhood, each one collapsing more visibly and more painfully than the last, culminating in a bankruptcy that reshaped the entire family's life when Desmond was 12. Young Desmond had watched hope repeatedly lead to devastating loss, and somewhere in that watching, he'd built an internal rule that had nothing to do with actual probability or realistic risk assessment, and everything to do with protecting himself from ever feeling what he'd watched his father feel. His realism wasn't measuring the world accurately. It was measuring an old wound and calling the result caution. I want to be very careful here, because this chapter is not an argument for recklessness, and it's not a claim that caution is always disguised fear. Genuine realism, clear-eyed assessment of actual risk, actual resources, actual probability, is an essential skill, and plenty of ambitious plans genuinely do deserve to be tempered by honest consideration of what could go wrong. The goal here is not to silence the cautious voice entirely. It's to learn to tell the difference between two voices that can sound remarkably similar but come from completely different places. The voice of genuine, grounded assessment, and the voice of old fear wearing reason's clothing. Here's a distinction worth carrying forward, because it's one of the most useful tools available for making this call. Genuine realism tends to be specific, and it tends to come paired with a path forward. It says something like, this particular approach has this particular weakness, so let's account for it. Or, this specific risk is real, so let's build in this specific safeguard. Fear disguised as realism, by contrast, tends to be vague and totalizing. It says things like, this probably won't work, or people like us don't get opportunities like that, or it's better not to get your hopes up. Statements that offer no specific insight, no path forward, nothing to actually work with. They simply lower the temperature of your hope without giving you anything useful in return. Desmond began, slowly, to apply this distinction to his own inner voice. The next time it rose, when a genuinely interesting opportunity appeared, and the familiar, calm reasons to pass on it started arriving, he paused and asked himself the question directly, is this specific, and does it come with a path forward? Or is this vague, and does it just want me to want less? More often than he expected, once he actually examined the voice, instead of simply obeying it, he found the second kind, old, vague, protective, and not actually describing the opportunity in front of him at all. This doesn't mean Desmond became reckless. If anything, learning to separate genuine caution from disguised fear made his risk assessment sharper, not looser, because he was finally evaluating opportunities on their actual merits, rather than filtering every single one, indiscriminately, through a decades-old rule built to protect a 12-year-old from a pain that had already happened, long ago, and could not happen again, in quite the same way. I want to offer you a practice to carry forward from this chapter, one you can use the next time you feel that familiar, calm, reasonable-sounding voice urging you toward less. Ask it directly, what, specifically, are you worried about? And what, specifically, would address that worry? If the voice can answer with something concrete, a real risk paired with a real mitigation, take it seriously, because it may genuinely be offering useful, grounded caution. But if the voice only offers vague deflation, a general sense that wanting this is unwise, a feeling more than an argument, notice that. Consider the possibility that you're not hearing wisdom in that moment. You're hearing an old wound, still trying, gently and persistently, to keep you small enough to never risk feeling that particular pain again. You are allowed, now, as an adult, with resources that child never had, to occasionally risk hoping for something and not getting it. That risk is not the catastrophe your old protective voice insists it is. It's simply, honestly, the cost of attempting anything that actually matters. A cost that a solution-focused life has to be willing to pay, again and again, in order to build anything worth having. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens once you've separated real caution from old fear, the specific mental skill of turning a big, overwhelming problem into something small enough to actually begin. Chapter 6. The size of the first step. There's a particular kind of paralysis that has nothing to do with laziness and everything to do with scale. You look at a problem, a genuinely important one, something that actually matters to your life, and instead of feeling motivated to act, you feel something closer to a low, quiet dread. Not because you don't care, because the problem, as it exists in your mind, is enormous, formless, too big to hold, let alone begin. This is one of the most common and most misunderstood barriers to solution-focused living, and I want to name it clearly, because once you can see it, you can work with it directly instead of mistaking it for a lack of motivation or discipline. The mind is simply not built to act on enormous, abstract goals. It's built to act on specific, immediate, physically doable steps. When a goal stays lodged in your mind as something huge and undefined, fix my finances, repair my marriage, turn my career around, the sheer scale of it activates something close to the same threat response we discussed back in Chapter 1, and the natural response to an overwhelming threat is not action, it's avoidance. This is why so many people, faced with a genuinely important problem, find themselves doing almost anything except addressing it directly, reorganizing a desk instead of starting the difficult project, scrolling instead of making the hard phone call, researching endlessly instead of actually beginning. This isn't a character flaw, and it deserves far more compassion than it usually gets, because what looks like procrastination from the outside is very often, underneath, a mind quietly overwhelmed by a problem it hasn't yet learned how to shrink down to a workable size. Let me tell you about a woman named Halima. Halima had been carrying, for the better part of a year, a vague but persistent sense that she needed to get her finances together, a phrase that had come to feel, in her mind, less like a task and more like a looming, shapeless cloud hanging over her entire life. Every time she thought about addressing it, the scope of it overwhelmed her before she'd even opened a single account statement. Debt to understand, a budget to build, savings to somehow start, a retirement plan she had no idea how to think about. The size of the whole undertaking, held all at once in her mind, was enough to keep her, month after month, doing nothing at all. Not because she didn't care, but because the problem, as she'd been holding it, offered no visible entry point small enough to actually step into. The shift came, almost accidentally, during a conversation with a friend who happened to work in financial planning. Halima described her overwhelm, expecting perhaps a lecture about budgeting discipline. Instead, her friend asked a much smaller question. Forget the whole picture for a second. Could you, this week, just look at one bank statement? Just look, nothing else. It sounded almost absurdly small, and that smallness, it turned out, was exactly the point. Halima could do that. Looking at one statement required nothing except opening an app and reading numbers she already had access to. She did it that evening, and something unexpected happened. The looking itself, small as it was, produced a small piece of actual information, which produced, in turn, a slightly clearer sense of what the next small step might be. Not the whole plan, just the next visible piece. This is the mechanism worth understanding deeply, because it's one of the most reliable tools available for moving through any large, overwhelming problem. Motivation, for most people, does not arrive before action and then produce it. It arrives after a small action, as a direct result of it. This runs against how most people intuitively expect change to work. They wait to feel ready, to feel motivated, to feel clear, before beginning. But readiness built this way rarely comes, because the mind, faced with an enormous, undefined problem, has nothing concrete to build momentum from. Shrink the problem down to something small enough to actually attempt, take that one small action, and something remarkable tends to happen on the other side of it. A small, real feeling of capability, which becomes the actual fuel for the next step, and the one after that. Halima's finances did not get resolved in that one evening of looking at a single statement. But something important shifted that evening regardless. The shapeless cloud she'd been avoiding for a year gained, for the first time, an edge, a place to stand. The following week, having seen the actual numbers instead of the vague dread surrounding them, she took a second small step, canceling a subscription she'd forgotten she was paying for, then a third, moving a small specific amount into a separate savings account. None of these steps, individually, solved the larger problem. But each one, small as it was, chipped away at the size of what remained, and more importantly, built a growing, lived sense of evidence that Halima was, in fact, someone capable of handling this. Evidence that no amount of abstract worrying across an entire year had ever managed to produce. There's a specific practice worth carrying forward from Halima's story, one that applies to nearly any overwhelming problem you might be facing. When a goal feels too large to approach, resist the urge to plan the entire path before taking a single step. Instead, ask yourself one narrower, more answerable question. What is the smallest possible action I could take today that would move me even slightly closer to this? Not the ideal action, not the most efficient action. The smallest one that's still real, small enough that some part of your mind can't find a credible excuse to avoid it. This might feel, at first, almost insultingly modest. Sending one email instead of solving the entire project. Doing 5 minutes of a difficult conversation instead of resolving the whole conflict in one sitting. Walking around the block instead of committing to an entire fitness overhaul. But the modesty is not a weakness of this approach. It's the entire mechanism by which it works. A small, doable step bypasses the threat response that an enormous, undefined goal triggers, and gives your mind something concrete enough to actually act on. And once you act, even in a small way, you generate real information and real momentum that no amount of thinking about the big picture on its own could ever have produced. I want to leave you, at the end of this chapter, with a reframe that will serve you for the rest of this journey and well beyond it. The size of the problem in your mind is not the same as the size of the next required action. A problem can be enormous, a marriage that needs real repair, a health condition that needs real attention, a career that needs a real overhaul, while the very next step required to begin addressing it remains small, specific, and entirely within reach today. Solution-focused thinking does not mean pretending big problems are small. It means learning, deliberately, to separate the true scale of a challenge from the achievable scale of its very next step, and then taking that step, regardless of how modest it feels, because modest and doable, repeated consistently, outperforms enormous and paralyzing every single time. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens after you've taken that first step, the particular mindset shift required to keep moving when the results don't arrive as quickly as you'd hoped. Chapter 7. When progress doesn't show up on schedule. There is a particular kind of discouragement that arrives, not at the beginning of a difficult effort, but somewhere in the middle of it, after the initial motivation has worn off, after the early enthusiasm has faded, but before any real results have become visible. This is, I think, one of the most dangerous points in any solution-focused effort, because it's exactly here, in this quiet, unglamorous middle stretch, that most people quietly give up, not because the approach was wrong, but because the timeline in their head didn't match the timeline reality actually offered. Think about how most meaningful change actually happens beneath the surface, before it ever becomes visible. A plant, in its first weeks after being planted, spends almost all of its energy building roots underground, invisible, unglamorous work that produces no visible growth above the soil at all. Anyone watching only the surface during that period would reasonably conclude that nothing is happening, that the effort isn't working, that it might be time to give up and try something else. And yet the invisible work happening below the surface is not only real, it's the entire foundation that makes the visible growth, when it finally arrives, possible at all. Most solution-focused effort works exactly this way, and almost no one prepares you for it. You take the small step, and then another, and then another. And for a stretch of time that can feel uncomfortably long, very little seems to change on the surface. The problem, from the outside, looks roughly the same as it did before you started. And it's precisely here, in this invisible root-building stage, that the old problem-focused mind, the one we spent Chapter 1 understanding, tends to resurface with a vengeance, whispering that the effort isn't working, that maybe the problem really is unsolvable after all, that perhaps it's time to retreat back into familiar complaint, rather than continuing to invest in change that doesn't seem to be paying off. Let me tell you about a man named Osei. Osei had decided, after years of chronic tension with his adult son, to genuinely change how he engaged in their relationship, to listen more than he corrected, to ask questions instead of offering immediate advice, to sit with discomfort instead of filling every silence with his own opinion. He began this effort with real sincerity, and for the first several months, almost nothing seemed to change. Conversations with his son remained, on the surface, roughly as strained as they'd always been. His son, understandably, wasn't quick to trust a sudden shift in his father's behavior. Years of a different pattern had taught him, reasonably, to be cautious about whether this change was real or temporary. Osei told me later that around the 4-month mark, he came very close to abandoning the whole effort. Nothing seemed to be working. His son still seemed guarded. Their conversations still felt effortful and thin. And the old familiar voice, the one insisting that some relationships simply can't be fixed, that maybe this was just how things were destined to be between them, grew louder with each visit that didn't produce the warmth Osei had been hoping for. What kept Osei going, in the end, wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. It was a conversation with a friend who reminded him of something simple but easy to forget in the middle of a difficult effort. Trust, once damaged over years, does not rebuild on the same timeline as the damage that broke it, and it rarely rebuilds in a smooth, visible upward line. It rebuilds the way roots grow, mostly invisible, mostly underground, showing almost nothing on the surface right up until, seemingly all at once, it does. Osei kept going, not because he suddenly felt certain it was working, but because he made a decision to trust the process, even without visible proof, for a defined period, rather than judging its success purely by what was observable in any given month. Around month 7, something shifted, small at first. His son, unprompted, called to talk through a work decision he was wrestling with, something he hadn't done in years. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. It was a small, quiet sign that something had been building, invisibly, the entire time. Root structure Osei couldn't see, right up until the moment it finally, quietly, broke the surface. This is the pattern worth understanding deeply, because it will almost certainly determine whether any solution-focused effort you undertake actually succeeds. Meaningful change is very often front-loaded with invisible effort and back-loaded with visible results. And the gap between those two, the stretch where you're doing real work but seeing little proof of it, is exactly where most people quit, mistaking a lack of visible progress for a lack of actual progress. I want to offer you a distinction here that changes how this middle stretch feels to live through. The absence of visible results is not the same as the absence of real change. A great deal of important change happens at a level too gradual, too internal, or too structural to be immediately observable. Trust slowly rebuilding beneath the surface of strained conversations, a skill slowly sharpening beneath the surface of unremarkable practice sessions, a body slowly strengthening beneath the surface of workouts that don't yet show a visible difference in the mirror. If you judge your progress purely by what's visible on any given day, you will very often conclude, wrongly, that nothing is happening, right at the exact moment when the invisible foundation is closest to finally breaking the surface. This doesn't mean every effort eventually pays off regardless of approach. Sometimes the approach genuinely does need adjusting, and part of solution-focused thinking is honestly evaluating, periodically, whether a given strategy is actually the right one. But there's an important difference between thoughtfully reassessing a strategy and abandoning an effort simply because the results haven't arrived as quickly as impatience would prefer. The first is wisdom. The second, far more often than people realize, is simply giving up during the root-building stage, one season before the visible growth was going to arrive. Here's a practical tool worth carrying forward from Ose's experience. Before you begin any significant solution-focused effort, decide in advance, honestly, what a reasonable timeline actually looks like. Not the timeline your impatience wants, but the timeline the specific kind of change you're pursuing actually tends to require. Rebuilding trust in a strained relationship typically takes months, sometimes longer, not days. Building a new skill to real competence typically takes sustained practice across weeks or months, not a single motivated weekend. Deciding this timeline honestly before you begin gives you something invaluable during the difficult middle stretch, a way to distinguish between "this isn't working" and "this is exactly how long this particular kind of change actually takes," a distinction that, without deciding it in advance, is almost impossible to make clearly while you're in the middle of the discouragement itself. I want to leave you, at the end of this chapter, with something worth returning to whenever you find yourself in that difficult, invisible middle stretch of any effort that matters to you. The absence of visible proof is not proof of absence. Somewhere beneath the surface of consistent, small, solution-focused effort, something is very often building that has not yet had the time it needs to become visible. The question worth asking, in that discouraging middle stretch, is rarely "is this working?" a question your impatience will almost always answer too early, and usually wrongly. The better question is, am I still doing the work that, given enough time, tends to produce this kind of change? If the honest answer is yes, the wisest thing you can often do is simply continue, not blindly, but with the patient trust of someone who understands that some of the most important growth in any life happens exactly where it can't yet be seen. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something that becomes essential once you're deep in that difficult middle stretch: how to keep your mind anchored to solutions, even when setbacks arrive, as they inevitably will, along the way. Chapter 8. When setbacks try to prove you wrong. At some point in any real solution-focused effort, not if, but when, something is going to go wrong, a step you took confidently will fail to produce what you expected. A plan you built carefully will run into an obstacle you didn't anticipate. And in that moment, a very particular, very familiar voice will rise up, quick and persuasive, ready to offer you an explanation that feels, in the sting of the moment, undeniably true. See, this proves it. This was never going to work. I want to spend this chapter looking closely at that moment, because how you meet it, more than almost anything else in this entire journey, determines whether a setback becomes a minor, temporary detour or a permanent stopping point. Here's what's worth understanding first. A setback and a defeat are not the same thing, even though, in the raw emotional aftermath of the moment, they can feel identical. A setback is a single event, a specific attempt that didn't produce the result you wanted, occurring at a specific point in time. A defeat is a conclusion, a broader verdict about the entire effort, drawn from that single event and then generalized outward, often far beyond what the event actually proves. The setback is factual. The defeat is an interpretation, built by the mind, in the vulnerable moment right after disappointment lands. And it's worth knowing that this is exactly the moment when the mind's interpretations are least reliable, not most. Let me tell you about a woman named Corinne. Corinne had spent months building toward launching a small product she'd been developing, pouring real effort, real savings, and real hope into the process. The launch, when it finally arrived, fell flat, a fraction of the interest she'd expected, feedback that was polite but unenthusiastic, sales numbers that made the whole effort feel, in the raw days immediately afterward, like a clear and total failure. In the days right after the launch, Corinne told me later, the story that arrived in her mind felt less like a thought and more like an obvious, undeniable fact. I'm not cut out for this. This confirms what I probably always suspected. I should go back to something safer. Every one of these sentences felt, in the moment, less like an interpretation and more like simple reality, finally revealing itself after months of hopeful denial. What changed things for Corinne wasn't willpower, and it wasn't simply staying positive in some forced, hollow way. It was a specific practice a mentor had taught her months earlier, before the launch had even happened, almost as though anticipating this exact moment would arrive. Whenever a setback lands, before drawing any conclusion about what it means, separate what actually happened from the story your mind is already building about what it means. Corinne sat down, a few days after the launch, and forced herself to write 2 separate lists. The first, what actually factually happened. The product launched. A specific, smaller-than-hoped number of people showed interest. The feedback she received pointed to 2 specific, nameable issues. The price point felt high relative to what people understood the product to do, and the messaging hadn't clearly communicated the actual problem it solved. That was the entire factual list. Notice how narrow, how specific, and how oddly unremarkable it looks, laid out plainly like that. The second list was everything her mind had been adding on top of those facts, unprompted, in the days since. I'm not cut out for this. I'll never succeed at anything like this. Everyone who matters now sees me as someone who failed. I should have known better than to try. Looking at the 2 lists side by side, Corinne noticed something that changed how she understood the entire experience. Almost none of the second list was actually supported by the first. The facts pointed to 2 specific, fixable problems, a pricing issue and a messaging issue. The story pointed to a sweeping, permanent verdict about her fundamental worth and capability. The facts were data. The story was a decision her mind had made, quickly and understandably, in the vulnerable aftermath of disappointment. And decisions, unlike facts, can be reconsidered. This distinction between the factual content of a setback and the interpretive story layered on top of it is one of the most valuable tools available to anyone trying to live a genuinely solution-focused life, because setbacks are not optional. They are a guaranteed, inevitable part of pursuing anything that actually matters. What's optional, what's actually within your control, is how much unearned, sweeping defeat you allow your mind to construct on top of the specific, factual, usually far more limited information the setback actually provides. Corinne, once she could see her 2 lists clearly, did something that felt almost strange at first. She went back to the specific, fixable problems the facts had actually revealed. She adjusted the pricing. She rebuilt the messaging around the specific problem her product solved, informed directly by the feedback she'd received. The second version of her launch, several weeks later, performed meaningfully better than the first, not because Corinne had simply believed in herself harder, but because she had extracted the actual, usable information from the setback, instead of drowning it beneath a story about her own fundamental inadequacy. I want to name something important here, because this chapter is not an argument for ignoring real problems or forcing artificial optimism onto genuine failure. Some setbacks genuinely do reveal that a particular approach needs real reconsideration, or even abandonment. The goal here is not to deny that setbacks contain real, useful information. It's to make sure you're extracting the actual information the setback offers, rather than the exaggerated, sweeping story your mind, in the raw aftermath of disappointment, tends to construct almost automatically. Here's a practice worth carrying forward from Corinne's experience, one you can use the next time a real setback lands in your own life. In the immediate aftermath, resist drawing any large conclusion at all. Give yourself, if you can, a day or 2 of simply feeling whatever's honest to feel, without yet deciding what it means. Then, when you're ready, do exactly what Corinne did. Write down, as plainly and factually as you can, what actually happened, stripped of interpretation, stripped of sweeping verdicts about your worth or your future. Then look honestly at whatever story your mind has been quietly building on top of those facts, and ask yourself directly, is this story actually supported by what happened? Or has my mind, understandably but unhelpfully, turned one specific, limited event into a permanent conclusion it was never actually big enough to prove. This single practice, separating fact from story in the wake of a setback, will not make setbacks stop happening. Nothing can promise you that, and anyone who does isn't being honest with you. But it will change, dramatically, how much unnecessary suffering each setback produces, and how quickly you're able to extract whatever real, usable information it contains, and return, with that information in hand, to the work of moving forward. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a subtle but powerful shift in the way you talk to yourself during difficulty, the specific language patterns that either reinforce a stuck, problem-focused mind or actively train it toward solutions, often without you even noticing the shift is happening. Chapter 9. The words you use without noticing. There is a kind of language most people use dozens of times a day without ever noticing its effect. Small, seemingly harmless phrases that quietly shape not just how a problem sounds, but how solvable it actually feels. And because these phrases are so common, so woven into ordinary speech, almost no one stops to examine them, and yet, examined closely, they turn out to carry far more weight than their casual, everyday tone would suggest. Consider the difference between two ways of describing the exact same situation. I'm stuck, and I haven't found the way through yet. Notice what happens in your body, even just reading those two sentences side by side. The first one has a closed, final quality to it. Stuck is a state, a condition, something you simply are, with no obvious direction implied at all. The second sentence describes the exact same reality, but frames it as a process still in motion, something not yet found, rather than something permanently absent. The facts haven't changed between those two sentences. The felt sense of possibility inside them has changed enormously. This is the quiet, underappreciated power of language on the mind. The words you habitually use to describe a difficulty don't just report on your internal state, they actively shape it, moment to moment, often below the level of conscious awareness. Say, "I'm terrible at this," enough times, in enough moments of frustration, and your mind begins treating that sentence less like a passing complaint and more like a settled fact about who you fundamentally are, a fact that then quietly filters every piece of future evidence, making you notice moments that confirm it and overlook moments that would contradict it. Let me tell you about a woman named Petra. Petra had for years described herself, in almost every context, as bad with technology. It had become such a fixed part of how she talked about herself that she said it almost automatically, the way someone might mention their height or their handedness, a simple fact requiring no further examination. And because she said it so often, to herself and to others, she approached every new piece of technology already bracing for failure, already primed to interpret any confusion as confirmation of a permanent limitation rather than a normal, temporary part of learning anything unfamiliar. The shift for Petra began, almost by accident, during a conversation with a colleague who gently pushed back the next time she said it. "You're not bad with technology," the colleague said. "You've just never had anyone walk you through it patiently. That's completely different." Petra initially brushed the comment off, but it stayed with her because it offered something her old sentence never had, a distinction between a permanent trait and a temporary, addressable gap. She began, deliberately, to change the language she used, even when it felt awkward and artificial at first. Instead of, "I'm bad with technology," she practiced saying, even just internally, "I haven't learned this particular thing yet." Instead of, "I always mess this up," she tried, "I'm still building this skill." The shift felt, in the early weeks, almost silly, as if she were simply choosing nicer words for the same underlying reality. But something started to change beneath the surface of the language itself. Framed as a permanent trait, every technological confusion had confirmed a fixed identity, and confirmation of a fixed identity offers no reason to keep trying. Framed as a skill still being built, the exact same confusion became simply expected, ordinary, and temporary, data about where she currently was in a learning process, rather than a verdict about who she permanently was. This distinction sits at the heart of what psychologists call a growth-oriented versus a fixed mindset. And I want to translate it here into something more concrete and practical than the phrase itself often conveys. It's not simply about positive thinking, and it's not about pretending difficulty doesn't exist. It's about the specific, structural difference between language that describes a state as fixed and permanent, and language that describes it as a process still unfolding. Because those two framings, even when describing identical underlying facts, produce radically different behavior. A fixed frame invites you to stop, because there's nothing further to do about a permanent trait. A process frame invites you to continue, because a process, by definition, is still moving toward somewhere. There's a particular category of language worth paying close attention to here, because it's especially common and especially corrosive: absolute language. Words like always and never, used in moments of frustration. I always do this. This never works out for me. Nothing I try makes a difference. These words feel, in the heat of a difficult moment, like simple honesty, an accurate summary of a frustrating pattern. But examined closely, they are almost never literally true. The person who says, "I always mess this up," has, if they think about it honestly, almost certainly gotten it right, at least some of the time. The person who says, "Nothing I try makes a difference," has, in nearly every real case, tried things that produced at least some partial effect. Absolute language exaggerates a real, specific frustration into a sweeping, permanent verdict, and the mind, remarkably, tends to believe whatever it repeats often enough, regardless of whether the repetition is factually accurate. I want to offer you a practice worth carrying forward from this chapter, one that requires no special skill, only attention. For the next week, simply notice, without trying to change anything yet, the language you use when describing a difficulty, either to yourself or out loud to someone else. Notice how often you reach for fixed, permanent language. I am, I always, I never, I can't. And notice, alongside it, how rarely you reach for process language. I haven't yet, I'm still learning, this is where I currently am. You don't need to force a change immediately. Simply noticing the pattern, the way we discussed noticing in Chapter 1, begins to loosen its automatic grip. Once you've spent some time simply noticing, you can begin the second part of this practice, which is where the real shift happens, deliberately choosing process language, even when it feels artificial at first, especially in moments of frustration. Instead of, "I'm terrible at managing my time," try, "I haven't yet built a system that works for how my brain actually operates." Instead of, "I always lose my temper in this conversation," try, "I'm still learning how to stay grounded when this particular topic comes up." The shift will feel, at first, like a small, almost cosmetic adjustment. You might even feel a little resistance to it, a sense that you're softening something that deserves to be stated bluntly. But give it time, and something genuine begins to happen underneath the words themselves. A mind that has spent months, even years, describing its struggles in process language rather than permanent language becomes, gradually, a mind that actually believes change remains possible. Because the words it's been repeating, day after day, have been quietly building exactly that belief, one sentence at a time. Petra's relationship with technology did not transform overnight because of a language shift alone, but something important changed in how she approached each new challenge, with the expectation of temporary confusion rather than permanent inadequacy, which meant she was far more willing to actually keep trying long enough to improve. Months later, colleagues who'd known her for years began commenting, genuinely surprised, on how much more comfortable she'd become with new systems and tools. Petra knew, by then, that the shift hadn't started with the technology at all. It had started with a sentence, a small, repeated choice about which words she was willing to let define her. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something closely related to language, the specific role that gratitude plays in training a solution-focused mind, and why it works very differently than most people assume it does. Chapter 10. Gratitude is not what you think it is. There's a particular kind of resistance many people feel when the word gratitude enters a conversation about difficulty, and I want to name that resistance honestly before we go any further, because it's completely understandable. When you're genuinely struggling, with a problem that hasn't resolved, a pain that's still present, a situation that hasn't improved, being told to focus on gratitude can feel, at best, beside the point, and at worst, like a subtle dismissal of everything that's actually hard about your life. If this resistance is present in you right now, I want you to know it's not a flaw in your character. It's a completely reasonable response to a version of gratitude that has, honestly, been oversimplified and overused to the point of losing most of its actual usefulness. So let's set aside the version of gratitude that shows up on inspirational posters and look instead at what gratitude actually is, mechanically, inside a mind that's trying to move from problem focus towards solution focus. Because understood correctly, it turns out to be one of the most practically useful tools available, for reasons that have very little to do with forced positivity and everything to do with how attention itself works. Remember from Chapter 1 that attention is not passive. It actively strengthens whatever pathway it repeatedly travels. A mind that spends its available attention scanning for what's wrong builds, over time, an ever sharper capacity for noticing problems, genuinely useful in the right context, but exhausting and distorting when it becomes the mind's only mode of operating. Gratitude, understood correctly, is not a denial of problems. It's a deliberate, regular exercise for the opposite muscle, the one that notices what's already working, what's already present, what's already, in some specific and concrete way, going right. And a mind that never exercises that second muscle finds it, over time, exactly as weak and hard to access as an unused muscle in the body, which means that even when real solutions and real resources are sitting in plain view, an untrained mind will often fail to notice them, simply because it's never built the capacity to look in that direction. Let me tell you about a man named Rowan. Rowan had gone through a genuinely difficult period, a health scare that resolved but left him anxious for months afterward, a marriage under real strain, a period at work that felt precarious in ways that kept him up at night. During this stretch, a well-meaning friend suggested he try keeping a gratitude journal, and Rowan, by his own account, nearly laughed at the suggestion. It felt, given everything actually happening in his life, almost insulting in its simplicity, as though writing down 3 nice things each night could meaningfully address a marriage under strain or a job that felt at risk. He tried it anyway, mostly to humor his friend, expecting little, and for the first week or two, it did feel exactly as hollow as he'd anticipated. Forced entries about coffee tasting good, or the weather being pleasant, disconnected from anything that actually mattered to him. But something began to shift, subtly, around the 3rd week, and it wasn't the entries themselves that mattered. It was what the daily practice was quietly training his attention to do. Rowan began, almost without meaning to, noticing things throughout his actual day that he might use in that evening's entry. A specific moment of genuine connection with his wife, even amid the broader strain in their relationship. A specific piece of positive feedback at work, even amid the broader uncertainty about his position. These weren't imaginary additions to a difficult reality. They were real, specific, true details that had always been present alongside the difficulty, but that his attention, locked for months in threat scanning mode, had been filtering out almost entirely, the same way an untrained mind filters out solutions we discussed back in Chapter 1. Here is what Rowan discovered, and what I want to offer you as the actual mechanism behind why this practice works, stripped of its greeting card reputation. Gratitude, practiced consistently, does not deny that a marriage is under strain or that a job feels uncertain. It simply prevents those difficulties from becoming the entirety of what your attention registers. And this matters enormously, practically, because a mind that can see only the difficulty has far less capacity to notice the specific resources, the specific moments of connection, the specific pieces of evidence that a path forward might exist. Rowan's noticed moment of genuine connection with his wife, small as it was, became something concrete he could build on in their next difficult conversation. A real data point, suggesting the relationship still held something worth working from, rather than a battlefield with nothing left standing. I want to be precise about something here, because it's easy to misunderstand. This is not the same as forcing yourself to feel grateful when you don't, or pretending a genuinely difficult situation is actually fine. Rowan's gratitude practice never asked him to feel good about his health scare or his marital strain. It simply asked him to notice, specifically and honestly, what else was also true alongside the difficulty, because almost no real situation, however hard, is composed of difficulty alone, even though a threat-scanning mind will often make it feel that way. There's a specific version of this practice worth carrying forward, more precise than the generic 3 good things version that's become so common it's lost much of its power. Instead of noting broad, vague gratitudes, I'm grateful for my family, I'm grateful for my health, practice noting specific, concrete instances. Not, I'm grateful for my marriage, but I'm grateful that my wife made a point of asking about my day, even though we've been distant lately. Not, I'm grateful for my job, but I'm grateful that my manager specifically mentioned my handling of that difficult client call. Specificity matters enormously here, because vague gratitude barely engages the attention muscle at all. It's too abstract to actually train anything. Specific gratitude forces your mind to search real memory for a real, concrete instance, and that searching itself is the exercise, the actual rep, that strengthens the noticing what's working pathway the same way problem focus has strengthened its opposite over years of repetition. I want to leave you, at the end of this chapter, with a reframe worth carrying into the rest of this journey. Gratitude, properly understood, is not a denial of your problems. It's the deliberate maintenance of a second, equally important capacity, the ability to notice what's already working, even in the middle of what isn't, a capacity that a solution-focused mind depends on, because solutions are almost always built from resources and connections that were already present, and a mind that's forgotten how to see them will struggle to build anything at all, no matter how real and available those resources actually are. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happens when solution-focused thinking meets other people. Specifically, how to hold on to this mindset even when you're surrounded by people who default to problem focus, without becoming isolated or dismissive of them in the process. Chapter 11. Staying grounded around problem-focused people. At some point in this journey, you're going to have an experience that catches you off guard. You'll have spent real time and real effort training your mind toward solutions, noticing what's working, taking small steps, separating fact from story after a setback, and then you'll walk into a room, or pick up the phone, or sit down at a family dinner, and find yourself surrounded by people whose entire way of relating to difficulty is built around something very different. Complaint, catastrophizing, a kind of shared, circular dwelling on what's wrong that seems to have no exit built into it at all. And here's what I want to prepare you for, honestly, because almost no one talks about this part. This can feel surprisingly disorienting. You might notice your own hard-won clarity starting to slip within minutes of being in that environment. You might catch yourself nodding along to a spiral of complaint you'd never have entered on your own, or feel a strange pressure to match the emotional tone of frustration in the room, even when some part of you knows a different way of looking at the situation is available. This isn't a sign that your training has failed. It's a sign that you've just encountered one of the most underestimated forces in human psychology, the sheer pull of shared emotional states between people who are physically or relationally close. Human beings are, at a level far below conscious choice, wired to synchronize with the emotional tone of the group around them. This wiring served real evolutionary purposes, a tribe that shared emotional states quickly, that caught fear or urgency from one member and spread it fast, responded to real danger more effectively than a tribe of emotionally disconnected individuals. But this same wiring, in a modern context, means that spending time around people whose default mode is problem-focused complaint can pull your own mind back toward that mode surprisingly fast, regardless of how much deliberate practice you've put into training it otherwise. Let me tell you about a woman named Thandiwe. Thandiwe had spent nearly a year deliberately building the kind of solution-focused habits we've discussed throughout this journey, noticing her language, taking small steps, separating fact from story. She'd made real, visible progress in her own life. And yet every time she visited her family of origin, a group with a long-standing, deeply comfortable culture of shared complaint, she noticed something troubling. Within a single dinner, she'd find herself back in old patterns, contributing to a spiral of grievance about circumstances that, on her own, she'd have approached completely differently. This confused and frustrated Thandiwe for a long time. She began to wonder if her progress over the past year had been an illusion, a kind of temporary performance that collapsed the moment she was tested by real, familiar pressure. But what she eventually came to understand, with the help of a therapist who specialized in family systems, was something more precise and, ultimately, more useful than the story she'd been telling herself. Her progress hadn't disappeared. She had simply never learned a specific, separate skill, the skill of maintaining her own internal state while surrounded by a different one, rather than automatically synchronizing with whatever emotional tone the room was already carrying. This is worth naming clearly, because it's a distinct skill from everything we've covered so far in this journey, and without it, even substantial personal progress can feel fragile the moment it's tested by a strong external pull in the opposite direction. Solution-focused thinking, practiced alone or with like-minded people, is one kind of skill. Maintaining solution-focused thinking, while surrounded by people actively pulling in a different direction, is a second, separate, and genuinely harder skill, one that requires not avoiding the harder situations, which usually isn't realistic anyway, but building a specific kind of internal anchor, sturdy enough to hold its shape, even under real social pressure. The practice Thandiwe's therapist suggested was simple to describe and genuinely difficult to execute, especially at first. Before entering a situation she knew would carry strong problem-focused pull, a particular family gathering, a particular friend known for extended venting sessions, she began taking a few minutes beforehand to consciously set an intention, something as simple as silently reminding herself, "I can listen with real care without matching the emotional spiral. I can be present with someone's difficulty without adopting it as my own internal state." This might sound almost too simple to matter, but the mechanism behind it is worth understanding. Conscious intention, set deliberately before entering a pulling environment, gives your mind a reference point to return to when the pull begins, something Thandiwe had never had before, because she'd always entered these situations without any conscious preparation at all, leaving her fully exposed to whatever emotional current was already running. She also learned a specific, practical tool for staying grounded in the moment itself, once the pull was already underway, noticing, internally, the exact moment her own state started shifting to match the room, and using that noticing as a cue to ask herself one quiet question, without necessarily voicing it out loud. Is this actually my problem to solve, or am I simply absorbing an emotional tone that isn't really mine? This distinction mattered enormously, because it separated two very different situations that had previously felt identical to Thandiwe, genuinely supporting someone she loved through real difficulty, which absolutely required her presence and care, versus simply absorbing an ambient emotional tone that had nothing to do with any specific problem she could actually help with, and everything to do with the contagious pull of shared complaint as its own kind of social bonding. I want to be careful here, because this chapter is not an argument for emotional distance from people you love, or for treating every conversation about difficulty as something to be managed and contained. Genuine empathy, genuine presence with someone else's pain, matters enormously, and a solution-focused mind that becomes cold or dismissive toward other people's real struggles has lost something important in the process, however clear its own thinking has become. The goal here is not to stop caring about the people around you, or to stop being present with their difficulties. It's to learn the difference between being present with someone's pain, which is a genuine act of love, and being swept into an unproductive spiral alongside them, which usually helps no one, including the person you're trying to support. There's a particular kind of presence worth cultivating here, one Thandiwe eventually learned to offer her family, and it's worth naming clearly because it threads this needle carefully, staying warm and engaged with someone's difficulty, genuinely listening, genuinely caring, while quietly declining to let your own internal state be fully hijacked by it. In practice, this often looked, for Thandiwe, like listening fully to a family member's complaint, offering real empathy for how hard the situation clearly felt, and then, gently, when there was room for it, offering a small solution-oriented question rather than simply adding her own grievance to the pile, not lecturing, not fixing prematurely, just a small, genuine offering of a different angle, left there for the other person to pick up or not, entirely as they chose. This shift did something Thandiwe hadn't fully anticipated. It changed not just her own experience of these gatherings, but, slowly, over time, some of the dynamics within them. She wasn't trying to change her family, and she was careful not to make that her goal. That would have been its own kind of exhausting, ultimately unsuccessful project. But a few family members, over time, noticed that conversations with Thandiwe tended to leave them feeling slightly more capable, slightly less stuck, than conversations that stayed purely in the register of shared complaint. And some of them, gradually, on their own initiative, began bringing a bit more of that energy into how they engaged with her specifically, even if the broader family culture remained largely unchanged. I want to leave you, at the end of this chapter, with something important to carry forward. You do not need to isolate yourself from problem-focused people in order to protect your own hard-won solution-focused mind. And in most cases, that kind of isolation wouldn't be realistic or even desirable anyway. What you need, instead, is the specific skill of staying anchored to your own internal state while remaining genuinely present with people who default to something different. A skill built, like everything else in this journey, through deliberate practice rather than sudden mastery, and one that gets steadily stronger every time you notice the pull beginning and choose, gently and without judgment, toward anyone in the room, including yourself, to hold your footing anyway. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a mindset trap that often shows up right when things finally start going well, the particular fear of losing solution-focused momentum, and how to build a foundation sturdy enough to hold even when circumstances change. Chapter 12. The fear that arrives with progress. There is a strange, rarely discussed phenomenon that shows up not when things are going badly, but precisely when they finally start going well. You've done real work. You've taken the small steps, weathered the invisible middle stretch, separated fact from story after setbacks, and something in your life has genuinely, visibly, begun to improve. And right there, in the middle of that improvement, a new and unexpected fear quietly arrives. What if this doesn't last? What if I lose this? This fear deserves real attention, because left unexamined, it can undo a great deal of hard-won progress, in a way that's almost invisible until it's already happened. It operates differently than the fear of failure we discussed earlier in this journey. It doesn't discourage you from trying. It arrives after trying has already succeeded, and it quietly, subtly, begins to poison the experience of that success itself, replacing the ability to actually inhabit and enjoy progress with a constant, low-grade vigilance against its potential loss. Let me tell you about a man named Kwame. Kwame had spent nearly 2 years applying the kind of solution-focused thinking we've discussed throughout this journey to a business he'd been struggling to grow, and the results, eventually, were real and visible: steady growth, a team he was proud of, a level of financial stability he hadn't had in years. And yet, rather than settling into that stability with any real sense of peace, Kwame found himself increasingly anxious, in a way that confused him deeply, precisely because circumstances were better than they'd ever been. He described it, when he finally named it out loud to a mentor, as a persistent background hum of dread, a sense that the good period was inherently temporary, that some unspecified collapse was quietly gathering somewhere just out of sight, waiting to arrive and take everything he'd built back away from him. What Kwame's mentor helped him see, over several conversations, was that this fear, while it felt like it was about the business, was actually rooted in something older and more familiar from earlier in this journey, the same protective, threat-scanning wiring we discussed in Chapter 1, now redirected toward a new target. A mind trained for years to scan constantly for danger doesn't simply switch off once circumstances improve. It often, instead, finds a new object to scan for, shifting from what's currently wrong to what could soon go wrong, given how good things currently are. This is sometimes described as a fear of one's own good fortune, and it's far more common than most people realize, particularly among those who've worked hard for improvement, rather than having it handed to them easily. There's a deeper, more specific dynamic worth naming here as well, one that applied directly to Kwame's situation. For many people, sustained difficulty over a long period becomes, without anyone choosing it consciously, a kind of familiar identity. The person who works hard against the odds, the person who's used to struggle, the person whose entire sense of competence has been built and proven specifically through hardship. When circumstances finally improve, this identity, ironically, can feel destabilized rather than validated, because the improved circumstances no longer require the specific skills and self-concept that had defined the person for so long. Kwame realized, uncomfortably, that some part of him had built real self-worth around being someone who persevered through struggle, and stability, paradoxically, threatened that identity in a way that struggle itself never had. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it explains a pattern many people notice in themselves without ever understanding it. A strange, self-sabotaging urge that sometimes arrives right after real success, picking a new fight, creating a new crisis, finding some way, consciously or not, to return to the familiar territory of struggle, rather than sitting with the unfamiliar territory of things genuinely going well. If you've ever felt this in yourself, I want you to know it doesn't mean you don't want good things. It often means, instead, that the identity built during difficulty hasn't yet been given permission or the necessary internal update to exist and feel legitimate inside a period of actual stability. What helped Kwame move through this wasn't forcing himself to simply relax, which proved impossible to do through willpower alone. It was a specific, deliberate practice of building a new relationship to stability itself, treating the skill of inhabiting good circumstances with the same seriousness and deliberate practice he'd once applied to solving problems. This meant concretely, actively noticing and naming moments of things going well, rather than letting his attention slide past them toward the next potential threat. It meant catching the old scanning reflex when it arose, the automatic mental search for what might go wrong next, and consciously redirecting it toward a different, equally honest question. What, specifically, is currently going right, and what did it actually take to build this? This last question mattered enormously, because it did something the anxious scanning never could. It let Kwame actually take in the reality that the stability he was now living inside wasn't fragile or accidental. It had been built, deliberately, through 2 years of exactly the kind of solution-focused effort we've walked through in this journey. Small steps, patience through the invisible middle stretch, honest response to setbacks. Naming that clearly, specifically, and often, gave Kwame something the vague background dread never allowed him: real, evidence-based trust in his own demonstrated capability, rather than a fragile hope that good luck might simply continue for a while longer before inevitably running out. I want to offer something important here, because this fear, left completely unexamined, can genuinely undermine real progress. The goal is not to eliminate all awareness of risk once things improve. Genuine, specific vigilance about real, identifiable risks to something you've built remains a healthy and useful part of maintaining it. The distinction, once again, echoes the one we drew back in Chapter 5, between genuine caution and old fear wearing caution's clothing. Specific, actionable vigilance, noticing an actual early warning sign in the business, addressing an actual emerging issue in a relationship, is worth taking seriously. Vague, constant dread, with no specific object, no actionable next step, arising simply because things are currently going well, is usually the old scanning reflex, still running, still looking for a threat to justify its own continued vigilance, regardless of whether one currently exists. Here's a practice worth carrying forward from Kwame's experience, one that applies to any area of your life where real progress has finally begun to show. When you notice things going well, resist the reflexive urge to immediately scan for what might undo it. Instead, pause and deliberately name, out loud if you can, what specifically is working and what it actually took to build it. Let yourself actually register the evidence of your own capability, rather than letting your attention slide past it toward the next imagined threat. And if genuine anxiety about the future does arise, ask it directly, the same way you learned to question the voice of disguised fear back in Chapter 5. Is this pointing to something specific and actionable, or is it simply an old habit of vigilance, looking for somewhere to land now that the original problem it was built to manage has finally, actually, been resolved. In the final chapters ahead, we're going to bring together everything we've walked through in this journey and look at what it means to live, not just occasionally, but as an ongoing way of being, with a mind that has genuinely learned to meet difficulty by reaching first for what's possible. Chapter 13: The difference between optimism and solution focus. There is an important distinction worth making clearly at this point in the journey, because the two ideas are so often confused with each other that people frequently believe they're practicing one when they're actually undermining the other. That distinction is between optimism and genuine solution focus, and understanding the difference between them may be one of the most practically useful ideas in this entire journey. Optimism, in its common, everyday meaning, is an expectation, a belief that things will probably turn out well. It's future-oriented, and it's largely about prediction. Solution focus, by contrast, is not primarily a prediction about outcomes at all. It's a discipline of attention in the present moment, a trained habit of directing your mind, right now, toward what's workable, rather than toward what's wrong. This distinction matters enormously, because optimism, untethered from action, can actually become a subtle obstacle to genuine solution-focused living, while solution focus, even without any particular optimism about the outcome, tends to produce real movement regardless. Let me explain why this distinction matters so much in practice. A person who is purely optimistic, in the common sense of the word, can sometimes fall into a specific and underappreciated trap. Because they expect things to work out, they can feel less urgency about actually taking the concrete, sometimes uncomfortable steps that would make a good outcome more likely. Their positive expectation about the future can quietly substitute for present action, rather than fueling it. Meanwhile, a person practicing genuine solution focus, even one who feels genuinely uncertain about how things will ultimately turn out, tends to keep taking the next available step, because the discipline was never really about predicting the outcome in the first place. It was about consistently directing attention and effort toward what's workable, regardless of what the future ultimately holds. Let me tell you about a man named Osborne. Osborne had, for most of his adult life, described himself proudly as an optimist, and in many ways, this served him well. He approached new challenges with genuine enthusiasm, rarely spiraled into despair, and was, by most measures, a genuinely pleasant person to be around during difficult periods. And yet, when a serious professional setback arrived, a major project he'd invested heavily in collapsed due to circumstances partly outside his control, his friends and colleagues noticed something troubling. Osborne's optimism, which had always seemed like a strength, translated in this specific crisis into something closer to passive waiting. He kept insisting, genuinely, that things would work out, that something would come along, that he'd always landed on his feet before and surely would again, while weeks passed without him taking any of the concrete, uncomfortable steps that might have actually helped his situation improve, updating his professional materials, reaching out to people who might know of opportunities, honestly assessing what had gone wrong in the collapsed project, so he could avoid repeating the same mistakes elsewhere. It took a close friend, watching this pattern with growing concern, to name something that landed hard. You keep saying it'll work out. What specifically are you doing to make it work out? Osborne had no clear answer, and the absence of an answer, once he sat with it honestly, revealed something he hadn't fully recognized about his own optimism. It had functioned, for years, less as a discipline of useful attention and more as a kind of comforting story he told himself, one that felt good to believe, but that had quietly excused him, in this particular crisis, from doing the harder, more specific work that solution focus actually requires. This is not, I want to be clear, an argument against feeling positive about the future. Genuine hope, held alongside real action, is a wonderful and important part of a well-lived life. The distinction I'm drawing here is specifically about what happens when positive expectation exists without corresponding action, because it's precisely in that gap that optimism, however well-intentioned, can quietly become a substitute for the harder, more specific discipline of actually working toward a solution, one concrete step at a time, regardless of how confident or uncertain you feel about the eventual outcome. Once Osborne understood this distinction, something shifted in how he approached the remainder of his professional setback. He stopped asking himself whether things would work out, a question he genuinely couldn't answer with certainty, and one that, in retrospect, had been quietly functioning as permission to wait rather than act. Instead, borrowing directly from the practice we discussed back in Chapter 6, he began asking a much narrower, more answerable question. What is the smallest specific action I could take today, regardless of how confident I feel about the eventual outcome? This question didn't require him to feel optimistic at all. It only required him to act, and the acting, it turned out, mattered far more than the feeling ever had. There's a related distinction worth drawing out here, because it clarifies something important about the entire journey we've walked through together. Solution-focused thinking is not primarily about how you feel, it's primarily about where your attention and effort actually go. You can practice genuine solution focus while feeling scared, uncertain, even doubtful about the outcome. And in fact, most people who accomplish genuinely difficult things report feeling exactly this way throughout much of the process, contrary to the popular image of confident, certain achievers moving smoothly toward inevitable success. What separates people who move through difficulty from people who stay stuck in it is rarely the presence or absence of confident feeling. It's the presence or absence of consistent, solution-directed action, taken regardless of what they happen to be feeling on any given day. I want to offer a reframe here that I think is genuinely liberating, because it removes a burden many people carry without realizing it. You do not need to feel optimistic in order to practice solution-focused thinking effectively. You do not need to believe, with confidence, that everything will work out in order to take the next small, concrete step available to you. This matters enormously for anyone who has ever felt like a fraud for practicing solution-focused habits, while privately still feeling scared or uncertain, as though the doubt somehow disqualifies the effort, or means you're doing it wrong. You're not doing it wrong. Doubt and effective, solution-directed action can coexist perfectly well, and in fact, they usually do, in almost everyone who's ever actually accomplished something difficult. Osborne's situation in the end did improve, not because his optimism was eventually vindicated by fate, but because he shifted from expecting a good outcome to actively building one concrete step at a time, without needing to feel certain about the results before he was willing to act. He found a new professional opportunity several months later, one that came directly from a specific outreach conversation he'd had, uncomfortable and uncertain as it felt in the moment, precisely because he'd finally stopped waiting for confidence to arrive before allowing himself to act. Here's what I want you to carry forward from this chapter, because I think it may be one of the most practically freeing ideas in this entire journey. You do not need to wait to feel confident or certain or optimistic before you're allowed to take the next solution-focused step. The feeling and the action are two separate things, and while it would be pleasant if the feeling always arrived first, real life rarely works that way. Far more often, as we discussed back in Chapter 6, the feeling of capability arrives after the action as a direct result of it, which means the most reliable path forward in any difficulty you're currently facing is not to wait until you feel ready. It's to take the next specific, available step regardless of how ready you currently feel, and let the confidence, if it comes at all, arrive afterward, as evidence of what you've already done, rather than as a prerequisite for doing it. In the next chapter, we're going to look at how everything we've covered in this journey actually comes together into a single, coherent daily practice. Not a checklist of separate techniques, but one integrated way of meeting each day that gradually becomes, with enough repetition, simply who you are. Chapter 14. A mind trained, not just informed. By now, you've encountered a great deal in this journey, enough ideas, enough distinctions, enough practices that it would be entirely reasonable to feel, at this point, slightly overwhelmed by all of it. I want to address that directly, because it matters for how you actually carry this forward. Understanding every idea in this journey, holding each distinction clearly in your conscious mind, is not, in itself, the goal. The goal as we discussed back in Chapter 3, is not insight for its own sake. It's a trained mind, one where these patterns have moved from something you have to consciously remember into something that has simply become your default way of meeting difficulty, the way an athlete's trained body responds to a sudden physical challenge without needing to consciously recall the individual mechanics of the movement. This distinction between information and training matters enormously, and I want to spend this chapter making it concrete, because it changes how you should think about everything you've absorbed throughout this journey. Knowing that resistance to a solution might be old fear rather than genuine caution, as we discussed in Chapter 5, does not by itself mean you'll recognize that resistance clearly the next time it arises in a real, emotionally charged moment. Knowing that a setback should be separated into fact and story, as we discussed in Chapter 8, does not mean you'll automatically make that separation the next time a real disappointment lands and your mind is flooded with the raw sting of it. Information sits in the thinking mind, available and understood, but often strangely inaccessible in the exact moments of real difficulty when it would actually be useful, precisely because those moments activate older, faster systems that don't consult careful, conscious understanding before reacting. This is why training, not just understanding, is the actual goal of everything we've walked through together. And training, as we discussed back in Chapter 11, happens through repetition, not through a single moment of comprehension, however clear that comprehension feels in the moment you first grasp it. Let me tell you about a woman named Adeze, whose story I think captures what this actually looks like over time, because it wasn't dramatic, and that's precisely the point. Adeze had spent roughly 18 months deliberately practicing the kinds of shifts we've discussed throughout this journey, noticing her problem-focused scanning, questioning her inner voice of disguised fear, taking small steps rather than waiting for overwhelming clarity, separating fact from story after setbacks. In the early months, every single one of these practices required real, conscious effort. She described it, at the time, as feeling like she was constantly translating, encountering a difficulty, then deliberately, effortfully, recalling which specific tool from her growing collection might apply, then consciously applying it, often after the automatic, old reaction had already partly taken hold. Somewhere around month 14 or 15, without any single dramatic turning point she could point to, Adeze noticed something had changed. A genuinely difficult situation arose at work, a project failing in a way that would, 18 months earlier, have sent her into days of anxious, circular problem-dwelling, and she noticed, almost with surprise, that her mind had already, on its own, without conscious effort, begun asking the kind of question we discussed back in Chapter 3, not "why is this happening to me?" but "what is the next specific thing I can actually do about this?" The shift hadn't been a decision in that moment, it had simply already happened, quietly, beneath conscious awareness, built from 18 months of consistent, effortful practice that had gradually, the way any skill develops, moved from effortful and conscious into automatic and default. This is what training actually produces, and it's worth understanding clearly because it changes how you should measure your own progress through everything we've covered in this journey. You are not aiming for a single moment of complete understanding after which everything simply changes. You are aiming, instead, for exactly what Adeze experienced, a long, often unglamorous period of consciously, effortfully applying these shifts, one difficult moment at a time, until eventually, without any single dramatic turning point, they become simply how your mind operates by default, the way any skill, practiced consistently enough for long enough, eventually stops requiring conscious effort at all. I want to be honest about the timeline here, because false promises would serve you poorly at this point in the journey. Adeze's shift took roughly a year and a half of consistent practice, and her experience is fairly typical, not unusually slow. This is not a journey that completes in a few weeks, however sincerely you apply what you've learned here. The mind's default patterns, built over years or decades of repetition, do not simply reverse themselves because you now understand, intellectually, that a different pattern might serve you better. They reverse through the same mechanism that built them in the first place. Sustained, consistent repetition, applied specifically and deliberately, in the actual moments of real difficulty, where the old pattern used to run unchallenged. Here's what I want to offer you, as a way of holding this timeline without becoming discouraged by it. Every single time you consciously apply one of the shifts we've discussed in this journey, every time you catch the old scanning reflex and deliberately redirect it, every time you separate fact from story after a setback, every time you take a small step instead of waiting for overwhelming clarity, you are not failing to have already mastered this. You are doing the actual training. The effort itself, however clumsy or conscious it still feels, is not a sign that the work isn't working. It is, quite literally, the work, the exact repetition that, given enough time, produces the kind of automatic, default shift Adaeze eventually experienced. I want to offer one final, practical piece of guidance here, something worth carrying forward as a simple, sustainable practice, rather than one more thing to remember among many. Rather than trying to consciously apply every single idea from this journey at once, which tends to produce exactly the kind of overwhelm that undermines consistent practice, choose one specific shift to focus on deliberately for the coming weeks. Perhaps it's simply noticing, as we discussed in Chapter 1, how long you spend in a problem before your attention turns toward a solution. Perhaps it's questioning your inner voice of disguised caution, as we discussed in Chapter 5. Whatever you choose, give it real, sustained attention for a meaningful stretch of time before adding another layer. Training, like everything else discussed in this journey, happens through depth and repetition in one area at a time, far more reliably than through scattered, shallow attention spread thinly across everything at once. Adaeze, looking back on her 18 months, described the process not as dramatic or sudden, but as something closer to how a path forms across an open field, not through a single decisive act, but through the same footsteps, walked consistently, in the same direction, until eventually a clear, visible trail exists where none did before, and walking it no longer requires conscious thought about which direction to go. That is what training a solution-focused mind actually looks like, stripped of any exaggeration, not a single transformation, but a path, walked patiently and repeatedly, until walking it becomes simply who you are. In the final chapter of this journey, we're going to bring everything together and look at what it means to carry this forward, not as one more set of techniques to remember, but as a quiet, steady way of meeting whatever life brings you next. Chapter 15, The Mind You're Building for the Rest of Your Life. We began this journey with a question, and I want to return to it now, gently, before we close. How much of your life have you spent thinking about your problems versus thinking about the way through them? That question, asked at the very beginning, was meant to unsettle something, to make you look, honestly, at a pattern you may never have examined directly before. I hope, by now, after everything we've walked through together, that question feels different in your hands than it did when we started. You know now, in a way you may not have known before, that the mind's pull toward problems is not a personal failing. It's an old, inherited wiring, built for a world that no longer quite exists, still running its ancient program in a modern life it was never designed for. And you know too, that this wiring, however old, however deeply grooved, is not fixed. You have walked, chapter by chapter, through what it actually takes to retrain it, not through force, not through denial, but through patient, repeated attention, redirected again and again toward what's workable, until redirection itself becomes less effortful, less conscious, more simply who you are. You have looked honestly at the resistance that sometimes rises even toward the solutions you say you want, and understood it not as proof those solutions are wrong, but often as an old, protective flinch toward the unfamiliar, worth questioning rather than obeying automatically. You have learned to separate the question that keeps a mind circling endlessly from the question that actually moves it forward, not abandoning understanding, but pairing it always with the harder, more useful question of what comes next. You have practiced inventorying what you already have, rather than measuring your life only by what's missing. You have learned to listen more carefully to the calm, reasonable-sounding voice that sometimes calls itself wisdom, while it quietly asks you to want less, and to tell the difference between genuine caution and old fear borrowing caution's voice. You have discovered that a problem too large to hold can nearly always be reduced to a step small enough to actually take, and that the size of the difficulty is never quite the same as the size of what's required to begin. You have learned to keep walking through the invisible, unglamorous middle stretch of real change, trusting the roots building beneath the surface, even when nothing yet shows above it. You have learned to meet setbacks by separating fact from story, extracting what's genuinely useful from disappointment, without drowning it in a verdict it was never actually large enough to prove. You have noticed the quiet power of your own language and the deliberate practice of gratitude, not as denial, but as the maintenance of a second, equally necessary way of seeing. You have learned how to stay anchored to your own clarity, even in rooms built around shared complaint, and you've named the strange, quiet fear that can arrive right in the middle of real progress, threatening to undo it from the inside. And you have come to understand, I hope clearly by now, that none of this depends on feeling confident before you act, that action, taken steadily, regardless of how uncertain it feels in the moment, is the actual engine of change, with confidence, when it arrives at all, simply following behind as evidence of what you've already done. That is a great deal to have walked through. If some of it has already faded, if you couldn't recite every chapter back in perfect detail right now, that's completely fine. That was never really the point. The point, as we discussed near the end of this journey, was never to memorize a set of ideas. It was to begin building, one repetition at a time, a mind that reaches, more and more often, for what's possible, rather than only for what's wrong. I want to leave you with something quieter than everything that's come before, because I think, at the end of a journey like this one, quiet is what actually serves you best. You do not need to leave this experience transformed overnight. You do not need tomorrow morning to look dramatically different from yesterday. What you need, simply, is to carry forward one small thread of what we've discussed here, a slightly greater willingness to notice where your attention goes, a slightly quicker return to solid ground after a setback, a slightly softer question asked of the voice that tells you to expect less. Small shifts, repeated patiently, are the entire mechanism by which a mind actually changes. There is no faster path than that, however much a part of you might wish there were. Consider, for a moment, the life this kind of mind eventually builds, not a life free of difficulty, because no such life exists for anyone, but a life met differently. Difficulty will still arrive, the way it arrives for everyone, in every life, without exception. But you will meet it, increasingly, as someone who has trained themselves to look, first, for the door, rather than only cataloging the walls. Someone who has learned that a problem, however real, is never the entire picture, that alongside it, almost always, sits some resource, some next step, some small and specific way forward, waiting simply to be noticed by a mind that has learned where to look. This is not a promise that your life will become easy. It's something better than that, I think. A quiet confidence that whatever arrives, you will have a way of meeting it. Not a guarantee of outcomes, because no one can offer you that honestly. A trust in your own process. A trust that has been built, patiently, through everything we've walked through together, and that will keep building, quietly, every time you choose, in some small, ordinary moment of your life, to turn your attention toward what's possible, instead of only what's wrong. So let this be where we rest, at the close of this journey, not with more to learn right now, just with a quiet, settled awareness of everything you already carry forward from here. The mind that scans for danger will still visit you sometimes. Let it. Notice it, gently, the way you've learned to notice throughout this journey, and then, when you're ready, turn your attention, patiently, toward what comes next. You are not the same mind that began this journey. Something in you has already shifted, quietly, chapter by chapter, even if you can't yet name exactly where. Trust that. Carry it forward. And whatever arrives in your life from here, meet it the way you've been learning to all along, not with certainty that it will be easy, but with quiet confidence that you already know, more than you did before, exactly where to look. Go gently into the rest of your day. You already have everything you need to begin.